Hello, and thank you so much for coming to today's WayWORD Festival's Queer Horror panel. The festival is brought to you by the Word Centre for Creative Writing with the generous support of Creative Scotland, Aberdeen City Council, and the University of Aberdeen. It is an absolute pleasure to have Jonathan Sims, Bibi June, and Dundas here with us today. I'd like to take a second to introduce our BSL interpreter, Leslie Creerer. For this panel, we'll be discussing exactly what queer horror is and what it means to write it. There'll be a discussion period for the panelists, and then we will open the floor to you, our audience, for a Q&A. And then at the end, we will have a book signing in the room back there. Next, I'd like to give each panelist a chance to introduce themselves. So, Jonny, if you'd like to go first.
Hi, I'm Jonny Sims. I'm a writer and performer. Most notably for the podcast The Magnus Archives, and my first novel, 13 Storeys, came out a couple of years ago, and I have another one coming out in October called Family Business.
Thank you very much. Bibi, you next.
Hi, I'm Bibi June. I'm a poet, performer, games maker. I just make all kinds of weird and wonderful art. And I write for queer horror podcast Folxlore, which is an anthology series set in Glasgow, exploring just all kinds of queer, spooky things like landlordism and demons.
Thank you so much. Ever?
Hi, I'm Ever, and I'm a novelist. And my first novel, Goblin, came out in 2017 and won the Solitaire First Book of the Year award. And my latest novel, sci-fi thriller, Hell Sands, will be out 11th of October, but I think it's available at the minute for anyone that wants to pick up early copies just now. And I also I think we forgot, we meant to do physical descriptions just in case anyone needs it. So I've got short, bright green hair, I'm wearing a leopard print coat, and I've got a Tales from the Crypt t-shirt on, which I'm not sure if you can really see, but it's a zombie reaching up to grab a very horrified looking man. But personally, I think he's just gone in for a hug, but you know.
Bibi again, I am a mixed-race, non-binary person with very short hair and round golden glasses, and I'm wearing a hiking top. It's not cool, but it's comfy.
I am a white man wearing a cozy jumper and a beanie to hide my gradually disappearing hair. I have a bushy beard that is it's getting more bushy because we're going into autumn.
And I'm McKenna the Chair. I'm a white woman with short black hair, and I'm wearing a white t-shirt with a little embroidered ghost on it. And with that, we will get into our discussion period. So the first question I'm going to address to Jonny, but is open to all of the panelists. What does queer horror mean to you, and how does your work address queerness?
So to me, queer horror is mainly it's a label, and so has all the uses of any sort of label, especially within a genre space, in terms of speaking to what themes might be found, what other work it might work well in conversation with, and often in terms of sort of setting assumptions as to content, who you might find writing it, who you might find represented within it. I think also, like any label, it is, like any sort of genre label especially, it starts to break down when you try to define clear borders, because borders between genres, between identities tend to inspire people trying to police borders and saying, oh, well, this isn't. My work addresses queerness, I think, in a changing way across it, because it's only within the last few years that I've become fully cognizant of my own queer identity. And it's strange to look at your own early work and be like, oh, that's why those themes were there. So I think there's, it used to be that I'd be like, oh yeah, no, I love to put queer characters in, love to put queer relationships in, because I'm a great ally, you know? I'm a great ally and representation's important. And gradually realizing, oh, they're in there because they speak to me, they speak about, like, my own feelings. So I don't think that my work is primarily about queerness because, as I say, it's only comparatively recently that is something that has been conscious for me. And I often feel that I don't have a lot of the experiences and context to dig into queer themes. So I think my work tends to try to reflect queerness as to my eyes, it exists in society, which is, it simply exists. People are. And that should be as true in horror and genre fiction as it is everywhere else.
Yeah, I think that was a pretty comprehensive definition. I think I would add that, to me, naming your work horror, it means sort of entering into a contract with your audience that you're allowed to scare them and they're there to be scared. And naming it queer horror means you're allowed to scare them with queer things that might be scary, that I might not myself put in work that I wouldn't call horror, unless I put some major content warnings on it, which I also do for my queer work, for my horror work. But naming something queer horror to me means saying I'm going to be exploring these things, and they're going to come from the perspective of a queer person, written for queer people, and they're going to talk about all the things that scare me as a queer person. And you're going to hopefully be scared, but it's going to do something for you that's not just making you feel really, really horrible. That's not what I enjoy in any piece of work, but there's definitely the aim of saying this is made with some level of kindness, even if there's no happy ending, or even if it's horrible, because it's horror. It's made with kindness and love and gentleness, as much as you can allow yourself in writing a horrible story. And I think that's what I try to do in my queer horror. And on top of that, I think queer horror can be incredibly expansive. I think there's lots of things that affect queer people that aren't about sexuality, that aren't about gender identity, that are to do with a society that inflicts horrible harm on queer people. And kind of flipping the viewpoint on that, saying, what does that look like as a queer person, rather than being written about, being used as a narrative device in a horror story? What does it mean when you flip that, and the queer person is the one looking out into a horrible world? What can you take from that and use in your horror, and almost showcase the horribleness of society and make it visible and really, really obvious how awful some people are and some structures are. Queer people can also be horrible, and they can be villains, and they can be awful people. And I like writing queer villains a lot, but I also really enjoy writing straight villains that are horrible because they are straight sometimes.
Just before I answer the question, I'm just going to point out that I'm using some notes, and it's because I'm chronically ill and have cognitive difficulties, usually called fibrofog. So I've got notes just to kind of help me keep me on track in case I lose my thoughts or have trouble with word recall. But it's also because I'm a chronic overthinker and chronic overpreparer. I'm a geek, it's true. And I've put my notes in a green eggs and ham book. I don't know why, but there's definitely something a bit queer and a tinge of horror in Dr. Seuss, I think. Kind of when I was thinking about this event and thinking about queer horror and how that manifests in my work, I actually decided to just look up in the dictionary and the thesaurus, what's the definition of queer? So I'm just going to read out a few queer synonyms for you. And there was a lot, so I'm not going to read them all, or it'll end up being like some weird thesaurus-based performance art, maybe some other time. So I think you'll see when I start reading these, like why I'm reading these and why they're relevant. So queer synonyms: strange, odd, peculiar, bizarre, weird, unconventional, unorthodox, uncanny, unexpected, unfamiliar, abnormal, anomalous, out of the ordinary, extraordinary, mystifying, perplexing, deviant, aberrant, eerie, unnatural, creepy, spooky, freaky, corrupt. There's also the definition of spoil or ruin. And I actually really love that. I think maybe a lot of people would kind of twitch at corrupt and spoil and ruin being as like the meaning of queer, as well as all those other words. But for me, it's a positive thing. I like this idea that queer means to spoil or ruin or corrupt normative society instead of kind of trying to become part of this normative society. And there's a really great moment in one of the Shadow and Bone books where a character says to another, they said, "You are ruined." And the retort from the character was, "I'm not ruined, I am ruination." And it's just, I love it. It just sent tingles through me, it really did. So I love that definition of queer. And it's also the fact, that I really love the kind of queer horror writers that I love are kind of messy, bad, kind of deviant queers reveling in difference, like Greg Araki and Clive Barker, Dennis Cooper, John Waters, of course, obviously. Although he's not usually called horror, but there's definitely horror elements to John. And I think, it's basically about not pandering to normative society. And in discussing race and nationality, Musa Okwonga said that acceptance by the dominant group is relying upon being good. Our social acceptance only conditional upon our very best behavior. But, when it comes to sexuality, for me, it's about eschewing the good queer, the assimilated queer. But also, like a lot of people don't quite understand that queer also isn't just about sexuality. It's, as Bell Hooks describes it, it's about being, about the self that is at odds with everything around it. And again, that takes us right back to the list of synonyms that I read out. So queer in my own work is basically about problematizing, problematizing what's normal, and what better means is there to do that than through horror. I think genres like fantasy and sci-fi really lend themselves to that as well. But most of all, when I was thinking about my own work, to me it's about embracing monstrousness. Again, some people might not appreciate that, but for me, monstrousness is a positive thing. And it's about horror that is often fluid, unfixed identities, the traversing of boundaries, and that's what queer is. By coming out of hidden spaces, monsters breach well-established boundaries. Normative society tells us monsters must be contained. Boundary rupture causes fear, panic, and uncertainty. Now take a moment, what does that remind you of? Especially recently with all the really disgusting abuse that trans people have faced. So I think society puts constraints on queer people, and if we breach those constraints, we're punished. And a lot of anti-discrimination work is about convincing people that we're people. But can we sidestep that and not play that game? And also, when we play that game of convincing that we're human, that's based on the human-animal hierarchy, where non-human animals are subjugated. But what if we refuse that? But just lastly, because I just want to acknowledge the dangers of this. I do understand, I'm not sitting here being flippant about being the kind of queer that's kind of against normative society and not fitting in, because I know there's dangers in that. But I think horror is a good way to explore those dangers, a safe way to explore these very real dangers that queer people face. And also horror is a safe space for confronting, as well as for confronting this, it's also for joy. Embracing monstrousness is a joyful, positive act. So, thank you. That's my little queer speech over, I'm sorry.
I think it's really interesting, like your point is like really good, that queerness is definitionally in relation to the normative, which means that often queerness and what queerness is and can be is like changeable depending on what the norm of society is. So it is like I was really into like raising Clive Barker especially, because so much of his work in sort of the 80s and 90s, when like queerness is vilified in a different way to how it is now, is aggressive, is sort of violent, and like dives into a lot of questions of bodies and the grotesque in ways that are like, you know, I really resonate with and really enjoy, but also that makes me sort of take a step back from like recommending him to everyone. And it's like, I think it's interesting how what queerness is and how queerness is seen does change and has changed queer horror. Like you talk about sort of queer horror as like quite kind or a source of joy, which I really love, and I try to have a lot of in my work as well. But it's interesting because I think that is something that is more possible now than it maybe has been in sort of earlier generations of queer horror, because like while there is this horrendous backlash and abuse, especially in terms of transness, I think more broadly within society there is more acceptance, more nuance, and more sort of, I think there is in the whole of society more kindness towards queerness these days, which I think is one of the reasons that those who do not feel that way become so vile. So I think it's interesting that, yeah, that relational aspect of queerness makes it changeable in a lot of ways.
I feel like, going off what you were saying, I'm not sure if I feel exactly the same way, but that's okay. I think there's definitely, for me, I find in horror the space to continue exploring queerness outside of how it is being accepted more. Being a trans person and talking about the transness in ways that aren't the traditional narrative, that aren't the ways in which transness now is more accepted, and what you were saying about monstrousness and all those things, that I really resonate with that, in that that's something I really embrace for myself, of not for me, queerness and transness is so much about expanding beyond anything I was taught and sometimes still feel I can be, and trying to let that go and trying to disrupt my own thinking into what is allowed and what is the box. And even if you expand the box, it's still a box, and maybe you can just be horrifying or whatever you want to be, and to who you are horrifying is interesting, obviously. And horror to me is a space where if you can still find joy within horror, to me that's sort of the one place where I find genuine joy, because it exists in a space where I am also allowed to be very, very sad and very, very horrified and very, very terrified, and also still experience joy. And that joy doesn't have to be just soft joy or sanitized joy. And I think that's, for me, it's the most important purpose behind why I write queer horror, is to find a semblance of joy. We'd probably have to agree on what joy means, I guess, in this framework. But yeah, that's really what queer horror kind of comes down to for me.
Yeah, those are all really great points. So relating to that then, do you find that horror as a genre kind of lends itself to exploring queerness, or due to a lot of the prominence of stereotypes and the punishment of deviance that you find in horror, does that make it harder to incorporate queer characters in a way that doesn't come across like, here's a queer person and now they're being punished? Given the prominence of stereotypes and the punishment of deviance and kind of bad characters in horror, do we find that horror is a more conservative genre, or does it lend itself to queerness more?
Yeah, I don't actually agree that horror is a conservative genre at all. I think obviously there's aspects of horror that can be, but basically I think you can say that about any genre, including literary fiction. There's obviously aspects of that in any genre. But as I was saying earlier, as we were all saying, there's also like horror really lends itself to queerness. And I was just thinking about the film Get Out the other day. Rather than like, it's the white middle class respectable family who are the villains of that film. So I think, horror definitely lends itself as a kind of way of subversion and kind of looking at the problems of our society.
Yeah, I completely agree that the idea of horror as a conservative genre is garbage, and I primarily blame. I blame the 50s EC horror comics in America because there was a series of Tales from the Crypt is one of them. And the thing about EC horror comics is they were grotesque, they were horrible, they were full of gore and people being ripped apart. But their pitch was, it's fine because each of these are moralistic stories. They are imparting good lessons, which meant that yes, it was because it was the 50s. These strong moral lessons were generally deviating from the social norms of 1950s white America is bad and will be punished. And a lot of the authors of the big American horror boom, Stephen King, Peter Straub, these sorts, in the sort of the 80s, grew up reading these comics. And like in Danse Macabre, Stephen King specifically says, horror is an inherently conservative genre because it is about enforcing social norms. But I think that is one of these things that is true for the horror that a specific generation of white male writers grew up with, and that has become accepted as a truism. Fundamentally, horror is a genre that reflects the fears of whoever is writing it and the society and the people that they are writing it for, which means that the fact that the most well-known horror writers of the last 200 years have broadly been cis straight white men means that most of the scary things that have been seen in mainstream horror are the things that scare cis straight white men, which is often us, and there are a lot of problematic stereotypes and this sort of thing, but often it is to do with who is viewing them and how they are viewed. I think a lot about the spooky asylum as this very this classically problematic trope, because it is vilifying mental health and saying, this place is scary because if you go there, there might be a maniac who is going to attack you, and it's horrible, demonizing people with mental health issues. But to me, that's not the scary thing about an asylum. The scary thing about an asylum is that you might be put there, that you like being institutionalized, having people tell you that how you see the world is not real, that what you feel is not real, and the worry that, are they right? Like, to me, that is what is really scary about the idea of an asylum, and often these stereotypes are horrible and problematic because they are being viewed, because it is the outside view that is seeing these things as scary, rather than the fact that it can be scary to be that, Sorry, I think that was a bit too long.
Yeah, I very much agree with both of you that horror reflects, like every genre, society, and in that sense reflects all the things that are wrong with society, and they are quite pronounced in horror. But I do also feel that in writing horror or creating horror, there is a responsibility to be aware of the harm that horror has done and continues to do as a genre in reinforcing stereotypes in terms of queerness, but also in many other things. And I'm really interested to be on a panel with you specifically. And for me, more so than queerness, horror continues to do a lot of harm in terms of disability representation. And that is still very accepted in ways that maybe vilifying queerness is becoming a lot less accepted, which unfortunately isn't really the case for representing a lot of things as inherently horrifying that are just people's everyday lives when it comes to disability. And in that sense, I feel a lot of pressure in writing horror to do it well. And I don't want to take on the pressure to to right all the wrongs of the people that have come before me. That obviously I'm not going to take on the burden of all these white men that have written before me. But I do also understand that as a queer person, you grow up in two worlds. You grow up in a queer world, but you also still grow up in a non-queer world. And those things, I still see. I actually don't watch that much horror because I'm a massive wimp, but I try to read a lot about horror and take in as much as I feel is healthy for my anxious brain. And it is very easy to replicate things despite your best intentions. So in that sense, I do feel there is a responsibility to not do that, and to examine those things when you write them, to be very responsible with the contract that you make with your audience, to say, the deeper you take your audience into fear, the more responsible you need to be in what you're actually saying with that fear, what that fear is about, what that fear is for. I find that very important, and I know that's not everyone thinks in that way, and I don't think it's a sort of a universal thing that everyone who writes horror should feel that way, but to me, I feel that responsibility. I feel it as a writer, I feel it as a performer, performing horror things, and especially, I think this comes a lot from a background of live performance and having a direct relation with your audience, where you can see them be horrified or see them be in fear and see them cry sometimes and be, okay, do I feel good about making people cry? And often I do. Like, sometimes that's the point of what I'm doing. And sometimes it's not. And then you have to go, okay, well, that's not nice, because I don't like when people cry when they don't have to. So yeah, both sides of that conversation, I think, are horror isn't inherently bad, obviously. I love it. But yeah, big responsibility.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that horror comes with a certain degree of responsibility. It is, all genres are asking the audience to feel something and say, come with me, I'm going to make you feel wonder, I'm going to make you feel tense. And because horror is saying, I'm going to make you afraid and I might upset you, then I think you're absolutely right that it is very important to take responsibility for that and try to be thoughtful about what you are saying. What you are saying is scary, how you are framing it, and to learn when you mess up and do your best.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree, yeah, but in terms of like disability representation in horror, I think in conservative horror, it can be an easy shortcut for them to just like plonk a disabled person in the film or the book or whatever, and just like they're inherently horrifying to us somehow, which is pretty, disgusting. But again, while I think it's easier for horror to do that, conservative horror, again, I would argue that literary fiction and other genres do as much harm in terms of that. I think especially lit fiction in terms of disability representation is really awful. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think especially with like body horror, especially because horror has this whole subgenre that is about about the body and making the body terrifying. That is, I think, in the right hands, I think that can be almost liberatory, but in the wrong hands, it's very easy to be like, this person is scary because they're really fat, or, oh, this person lost their hand and has replaced it with some sort of horrible thing. And so I think there are a lot of, I think there are pitfalls and dangers that are specific to the horror genre, but I think you're also right that these are things that you need to be thoughtful in whatever you're writing. And horror is not unique in having these challenges, but I think there are some things that are more of a challenge within the horror space than perhaps other genres.
Yeah, just wanted to say briefly that, yeah, I agree in terms of body horror. Again, it can be used badly, but I'm personally a huge fan of body horror. It's probably the main body horror that I love, and it's in Hell Sands, I really just threw everything at Hell Sands in terms of body horror. And for me, as someone who's disabled and who's had allergies over the years and all this, I kind of threw all that at Hell Sands, and like for me, it was like a good thing. I don't know how readers are going to react to it, but I certainly hope it's not me stigmatizing anyone.
Hopefully they'll go, "Whoa."
Yeah, I hope so, yeah. Be slightly grossed out. You've got that to look forward to.
Yeah, I'm nowhere on time. Just very briefly, I think it's a great space to, in the same way with queerness, where you can flip it. I think you can do the exact same, and even more so because it's done so badly so often. There's so much space to do it really well and very interestingly. And I think mostly I really admire how you do that, and I think that's mostly what I was saying. And I find it quite difficult as a disabled person as well. I have a lot of chronic pain. I find it really difficult to write about pain, especially in horror, because I feel like I have a block almost in writing about it and letting myself write about it into the depths of it. So it's just something I very much admire.
I agree, actually. I think in terms of pain itself, I've actually really struggled to write about pain. It's something I was just thinking about last night, actually, when I was in pain. I think it's something that's just really difficult to write about and find the words for. So I do kind of one day hope I can do that, but yeah, I understand that, yeah.
Great. I'm loving this discussion part. But with that, I would like to open the floor to you, our audience. You'll see that you have microphones on the desk. When you, if you want to raise your hands, and I'll call on someone, and when you want to speak, if you will press the speak button on the microphone, say your question, and then turn it back off, that would be great. So, any questions? Yes, the person in the second row.
Mostly to Bibi, you mentioned that you were an anxious wimp and didn't really consume that much horror. I definitely relate to that. I tried to get through the Magnus Archives and I couldn't get past halfway through season 1 because I gave myself an anxiety attack. Being an audio drama writer too, I wrote a contemporary queer adaptation of Dracula, and I actually took a lot of the horror elements away from it and focused on the comedy. So I was wondering, as someone who's like that, who's anxious, how do you find writing horror? Does the fear actually help you, or does it kind of hinder?
Yeah, I think it does both, in a way. It's harder. I feel it's very important to do a lot of research when you write stuff and to really know what you're writing and what context you're writing in. And in that sense, sometimes I have to kind of force myself to listen to things and do it in a brightly lit room and, make sure I'm in a place where that's good and not bad for me. But on the other hand, I think, and that a lot of that has to do with horror being often quite bad, and sometimes even bad horror can be important to know about. So I still try to take in some bad horror, but there's also a lot of good horror, and the horror I enjoy often is also the kind of horror that I write, which is a lot more subtle in why it's scary. I hate jump scares, for example. That just it's effective, and it's a bit too effective for me. And so I don't write jump scares into my horror, but I do write one of my favorite things that I've written for Folxlore, the audio drama that I write, is an episode. It's just a series of letters between a young trans person and an older trans person, and somehow the first letter got mixed up and ended up at this address of this older trans person, and they start this letter writing. And spoilers, but it's fine because it's my own show, so I can do that. The horrible bit about it, they just talk about being trans, and sometimes they talk about how it's hard, and sometimes they talk about how great it is. The horror about it is that it's a time loop, and this person is talking to themselves. And for me, the horror is realizing that this young person that's so full of hope and full of dreams is talking to an older version of themselves that's still really unhappy. And that may have, sure, they're trans and that's fine now because they're a bit older and they figured that out, but they're still unhappy. And this idea that you're not going to get out of that. And even if you're, as an older person, going, it's going to get much better, and actually you're going, but it's not though. And that really scares me. So it's very subtle horror in that sense. And it's definitely not the most hardcore horror thing I've ever written, but I think there's a lot of things that are scary that don't make your heart beat 100 miles an hour, that don't make your body respond in a way that, for me, triggers a lot of anxiety. That horror can be great. There's some of that I enjoy, but there's also a lot of scary things that just make your heart bleed a little bit, that just make you just go, oh, that really scares me, not in a heart-racing way, but in a sort of existential, oh dear Lord, oh God, is this really how it is, kind of way. And I enjoy a lot of that more subtle horror, and that's what I end up writing. And I think we need a lot more of that as well, because, I think there's a lot of space for that within horror as a genre.
Piggybacking off the back of your point, I think there's also a lot of horror hits different people differently in different mediums. I know a lot of people who, you said, Magnus Archives couldn't deal with it. I know a lot of people who don't find it scary at all because listening to horror is not something that affects them at all, but they cannot watch a horror movie. I find one of the reasons I did it in audio is because I find a spoken horror story really gets me. And reading horror, I can tolerate a lot more visceral stuff than I can in a movie. I find in horror movies I love atmosphere, I love creeping dread, but I find depictions of suffering actually incredibly upsetting, and I have a lot more actually as I've gotten older. So there are a lot of horror movies that I also I struggle with, and I'm like, it turns out for this particular horror movie, I'm a massive wimp because it's got a scene of somebody in incredible pain and it lingers on it in a way that I find very upsetting. So I think it is also worth sort of experimenting with what sorts of horror from a medium point of view do or don't affect you, as well as what sort of horror in terms of content speaks to you.
Yeah, it's really interesting the way different people respond to different kinds of horror, because I was just telling Jonny in the green room before we came on that I was really unwell a couple of years ago and was struggling to read books, but I put the Magnus Archives on and in a dark room, headphones on, and I find it soothing. So thank you, Jonny.
Okay, person in the second row in the black top.
Hi, I'll try and phrase my question because I've been thinking about it the entire time and I still haven't found the right sentence, but you all... Oh? Yeah? Are you okay with me? Yeah? All right. Hi. So I'll try and phrase my question. I've been trying to figure it out this entire time, but all of you will be writing things that comment on the world, and you'll have social commentary in your work. And I tend to run tabletop role-playing games. A lot of my players are straight white men, and I do try to mix in a little bit of social commentary and let them see the world I can see it and let them play through it. And I've been struggling with balancing, not making it too heavy-handed, but also making it impactful. And I was wondering how you, as writers who do write with things like this, handle it, and if you have any tips for that.
I think tabletop games are a specific challenge in this regard. Obviously, I with my partner, we put out various tabletop role-playing games, but because role-playing and tabletop games are, by their nature, a collaborative storytelling experience, it is by nature going to, if you're playing with a lot of straight white men, then if you've got 4 straight white men and you, then 80% of that story is going to be straight white man stuff. So I think there's a limited amount you can do in terms of like pushing or explicitly making it about those things. So I wouldn't beat yourself up too much about it. But I think that's the sort of thing that's really good to talk through in a session 0. When you're starting a new campaign, when you're starting a new game, discuss it with them and say, hey, these are the themes that I'd really like to explore. Because if players are bought in on what themes are going to be explored right from the start, then you can have really, to my mind, transformative games. But yeah, I think because it is a collaborative thing, it is always better to try and talk it through and get people invested rather than trying to sort of guide them through a theme.
I think you nailed it. I don't have anything to add to that.
I think it's a really interesting question because heavy-handedness and the idea of preachiness in art really interests me. I've had the privilege to go to quite a lot of trans plays in sort of mainstream theaters recently, which is amazing that exists. First of all, that's great. And there's some I've enjoyed a lot more than others, exactly because of heavy-handedness and because of preachiness and feeling sometimes like I'm being talked to instead of like I'm watching a play. And I think that goes for any medium, whether it's audio drama or theater or a role-playing game. And as the DM, or as the GM, depending on the game you're playing, I always say DM, which is a very bad habit. You are kind of in the writer's seat, again, depending on the game you're playing. Some are more collaborative than others. And I understand that worry of being too heavy-handed. It's something I really dislike in a lot of things. But on the other hand, especially in role-playing games, sometimes you have to be a bit heavy-handed, whether that is about story beats you're trying to hit and your players are going like, nah, we're going to actually go off and spend like 5 hours in the bookshop and you're going to have to come up with like 500 different books that exist in your fantasy world. And I think at any point, inhabiting your world with people from different backgrounds and creating stories around the experiences that they are having is never heavy-handed, because that's just populating your world in a realistic way, whatever that means in a fantasy world. But having diversity of stories, diversity of backgrounds, diversity of who they may encounter, how they react to those people and those stories is up to them. But saying you will encounter these people and you will have to treat them with some level of goodness and kindness, because otherwise I'm not gonna, put all this effort into your game for you. I don't think can ever be considered heavy-handed in that way. On the other hand, I do think it's very important to show and not tell a lot of the time, and to create scenarios rather than opportunities for you, as whether it's as a writer or anything else, to just say what you want to be saying. You can do that at a panel. You can't do that in your art, I think, personally. I think as an artist, as a writer, as whatever you do, it's very important to think about what you want to say, and then think about how you're going to write a story about it, because ultimately that's what people are there for. They're there for a story. They're there for art. They're not there for a panel, unless you are here now for a panel, but not when you're picking up a book or watching a play. Yeah. So.
I will, however, say that I am of the firm belief that if no one calls your work preachy, then you have been too subtle. Because there are plenty of terrible people out there who if they can miss the point, you've been too subtle. And if they don't miss the point, they're going to be like, oh, it's a bit preachy. Yes, I'm preaching that you're a bad person.
person in the front row here in the blue jumper.
Yes, Mr. Sims, I wanted to say about your comment about asylums. Excellent point, and it brought up the movie A Beautiful Mind with Russell Crowe. Familiar? Scary concept, but based on a true story, so it's very interesting. The question I had actually for everyone is if you could briefly give me an idea. I'm just curious to know, did it start off queer horror, or did it start off horror and then develop queer horror, or vice versa, that sort of thing?
Do you mean in our own work?
Yes, yeah.
Well, I'm just both queer and possibly a bit horrifying, and it's just I think it just came naturally. It's not like I sat down and go, okay, I'm going to write queer horror. So yeah, I've always loved genre. I've always loved horror. I'm a queer person, and a big fan of what queer means, not just in terms of sexuality, but about problematizing the normative society, and using genre to do that. I think that's really powerful. Yeah, so that's where I come out.
Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same for me. There's definitely work that I would describe very explicitly as queer horror. That was that from the get-go. I work a lot collaboratively, and everyone in the room knows that that's what we're making, and we talk about what that means in terms of what we want to write. And then there's work I make that doesn't explicitly, doesn't have explicit themes of queerness as said as queerness, but they're coming from the point of view of someone who is trans, who is queer, who I feel like so much of my worldview is shaped by that it's going to be in there regardless. And I have no struggle with ever calling my work queer horror or whatever genre I write in, even if it's not explicitly about being queer, because I think that is a perspective that is there regardless, and that I think a lot of people will enjoy knowing about before they see it, because they might go, cool, I'm queer, or I'm interested in queerness, I'm an ally, Jonny. So in that sense, yeah, why not call it queer horror when you're really, really, really queer? That's my perspective on that.
So I live in London. Which means that a lot of my sorry,
I live in London too, so
so most, like, all three of my first horror books, the 13 Stories, the one that's coming out, and the one I am currently trying to gradually get written, they are all primarily set in London, because that's what I know, that's where I am. When I reach for a location, I'm more likely to reach for Hackney, because I'm like, oh no, I know that street in Hackney, I can just place a shop there. But the third book is focusing very heavily on the London Underground, and feels very much like it is about London and kind of my relationship to it. And I think it's kind of the same with queerness. Like, it is who you are, it is part of you. And so it's always going to be there in your work, whether you are actively reaching it for it or not. But there are works that you write that are more or less about it, that you're sort of taking a moment to be like, okay, this one is about my queerness. This is about it as a more of a central theme. So I think it's not a linear progress of like, oh, it starts horror, becomes queer, or like, oh, I'm getting gradually queerer and queerer through my horror. It's like different works will engage with it more or less directly and more or less fully, but it's always going to be there, because what you write ultimately can only come from you.
I do like the idea that inherently horror is just queer, and the more horror you write, the more queer you get. So any horror will eventually become queer horror.
Stephen King, the queerest of them all.
It's great. Okay, I think we have just enough time for one more short question. So I'm going to say the person in the back row in the black shirt.
I was wondering with the kind of tropes, do you want me to take my... I was wondering with like the tropes in stuff and not wanting to, you know, demonize things that are very normal. At the same time, be it kind of mental health or sexuality or these things are also kind of inherently scary to either be or to experience because they are seen as abnormal. So it's kind of, to what extent is, in like your queer horror and stuff, is it a case of actually giving characters the freedom to be those tropes as well and not be those tropes because you want to actively go against that, when in some ways some of the tropes are there because that's then how those people experience that, because that's been what's put on them by other people?
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes sense, you know, in terms of my own experience with chronic illness, it makes sense that people are scared of being ill and scared of things that they don't understand and don't know about. And it would be bizarre to say you shouldn't be scared of being in pain, especially being in pain 24/7. But I think what's important is when, say, maybe non-disabled people write those tropes, they do it badly, and it's all, you know, the tropes end up being about overcoming and, you know, just an inspiration porn and all this nonsense. But from my point of view, you know, I can acknowledge that, say, living with a chronic illness obviously isn't always pleasant, but I can give the reality of that and show that you can live a joyous, wonderful life while being in pain 24/7. Like, it's possible. So you can acknowledge the difficulties, you know, not brush over that and not just be, you know, because there's also this toxic positivity thing. So you don't want to go down that route either. So it's just about how you play it, you know, the nuance of it. That's from my experience anyway.
Yeah, horror is so full of tropes, obviously. And I think horror is at its best when I love tropes, and I think it's at its best when it plays with those tropes, and not unlike an edgy, I'm going to reinvent all these things, and you thought it was this, but actually it's this other boring thing. But tropes, I think, are amazing, because so much of what we write is at its best when we have this shared understanding of something that we can play off of. If you don't have to explain everything, if you don't have to go into detail about every little thing, because we have this shared understanding. And tropes are a really nice way of doing that. I don't think there are many tropes that are inherently harmful. I think most of them can be rewritten or used in a way that just shows a different perspective on them. And I think it can be really harmful to put tropes on real people, to say, oh, all bisexual people are like that. You know, and that does happen a lot, especially within queer communities, I think. We have a lot of, and they become stereotypes, obviously, but they're kind of the same thing. And when you then translate that into your writing, it's just a bit boring. But at the same time, I know that as a trans person, there's a lot of things that I feel, I hate, for example, I consider myself trans-masc, for example, and there was a while where mullets were really in for trans-masc people, and I had a mullet, and I was like, but it really sucks that everyone's like, isn't it so funny that all trans-masc people now have mullets? I'm like, well, yeah, I just look fucking great, like, what are you talking about, right? And it can be really harmful to not be allowed to feel what you're feeling, to not be allowed to like what you like, because you're considered boring or mainstream. Whatever the harm is in fulfilling a stereotype, I think it can be really harmful to the development of a queer person as they get queer and queer over time, which happens to the best of us, to end up feeling like they have to like stop that somehow or hinder that, or even if it's just a phase you're going through. It's not a phase, Mom, but sometimes it is, and that's also fine. And translating that into writing and writing queer characters, and you know, I think it can be really fun to write a character that starts off as a trope and give them depth, and they're still allowed to be that trope, but they also have depth, and they're at the same time more than that, and exactly fulfilling the trope, and exactly being that thing. I've kind of lost my train of thought there, but I think that's about all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I also think like one thing I do love about tropes is they are inherently in conversation with each other. They are always going to be, coming across an instance of a trope is always going to be interacting with every other instance of that trope you have encountered. And I think it is absolutely possible to take those tropes and explore them and explode them and use them in ways that are liberatory. But I do think that to do that, you have to be coming from a place of truth. It needs to be, you kind of need to be, to a certain degree, inside the trope yourself to explore it in a way that is honest and truthful and not guesswork, I guess, or a way that doesn't often accidentally just reproduce these sort of harmful stereotypes. Though I will also say that I think that truth is something that has to be kind of within the author. I think there's often a lot of readers trying to sort of deduce things about authors so that they can judge whether, you actually have experience with this? Are you allowed to be? And I think often it is obvious from the writing. I think it is on authors to be thoughtful and cognizant of what tropes they can explore in a liberatory or meaningful way, and what tropes aren't theirs to play with. And I think as a reader, it's often obvious which is which, and it's about, as a reader or a listener or an audience, it's about your relationship to the trope and your relationship to what is being said. I think there are plenty of writers who have explored I keep coming back to Clive Barker, but Clive Barker is exploring sexuality in a very real and visceral way that is clearly very true to himself. But I've got a lot of queer friends who react very badly and can't deal with Clive Barker stuff because it resonates with them in ways that they really dislike. So I think it's on all of us to be cognizant of tropes and how we write them and how we read them.
That's great. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our panel today. Thanks so much to all of you for being here. It has been an absolute delight to be a part of this discussion. They'll be doing a book signing in the room just back there. And Blackwell's has a table set up there where you can purchase all of their currently out books. Additionally, they're doing a 15% off sale for the rest of the festival, so get in on that while you still can. Thanks so much to Leslie Creerer, our delightful BSL interpreter. Thank you so much to the Media Services team and the WayWORD Festival team for making all of this possible. Thanks again to Creative Scotland, Aberdeen City Council, and the University of Aberdeen for their generous funding of the festival. And thank you once again to Bibi, Ever, and Jonny for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for attending. I hope you all had as good a time as I did, and I'll see you at the book signing.
And thank you to you, McKenna.